Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to our sessions. This is session 2. This is, I think, it's equally exciting sessions, and we're not only talking about money. We also go beyond the money, talking about trade and talking about global networks. And I believe this is a highly timely topic, given the increasing interactions between the trade fragmentations, global value chains, inflation dynamics, and monetary policies. So we're very fortunate to have Professor Şebnem Kalemli-Özcan with us this afternoon to present her paper, which is co-authored with Ken Soyolu and Mohammed Yudelian. This paper is notable not only for its timely topic, but also for its modeling approach. It integrates global production networks, sectoral price rigidities, and incomplete financial markets into a multi-country new Keynesian framework, which offers a rich way for us to think about tariff, monetary policies, and international spillovers. So Professor Kalemli-Özcan is a Schreiber family professors of economics at Brown University, directors of the Global Linkages Lab, and a research associate at NBER and research fellow at CEPR. I have to say the professor is also very actively engaged with the BIS community through her work, advisors, conferences, and policy discussions, and is highly received by BIS staff. Thank you. Now, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this amazing conference. Let me start by saying also in the next 30 minutes, I'm going to focus mostly on the paper Tao mentioned, titled Global Networks, Monetary Policy and Trade, but also some other papers related that we have been working on in this space at the Global Linkages Lab during the last year and a half. I'm going to start with a question today. And the question is about understanding monetary policy making in a global interdependent world. Should geopolitics or weaponization of global interdependence change the way we think about monetary policy making? So the answer of this question is going to depend on three things. First, how do trade relationships and financial portfolios are going to shape in this new geopolitically fragmented world? Second, what are the implications of these changes of trade patterns and financial flows on currencies and exchange rates? And third, what are the implications of these changes on the international transmission of shocks? Now, I'm going to provide some new insights, new analytical insights from these, what we call Globalization 2.0 projects at the Global Linkages Lab of Brown University, and I'm going to combine them with the previous findings from my work on the international transmission of monetary policy and also work of others. Okay, let me start with this figure. I'm sure you've seen variants of this figure. Since 2020, there has been this increased use of protectionist tools. Different countries call these tools differently. Some call tools of economic leverage, some call tools of economic security, national security, geoeconomics. I mean, no matter what you call them, they are protectionist tools and they are shaping global outcomes. You can see the dominance of red color starting 2020, and after that combined with pink and different layers of variants of green color. These are basically subsidies, industrial policy, import restrictions, export restrictions, and restrictions on FDI and other type of investment. So, in that sense, maybe the increase is new. And I would like to start focusing tariffs as restrictions on trade has been dominating this increase. But in terms of even the use of these tools might be increasing and maybe new, the views on this is not new, right? So if you think about geopolitics and trade, there has always been two views, two foundational views on hegemon's trade and international monetary system. The first one goes back to Kindleberger's 1941 address and then made forceful in 1973 is the stabilizer view. The stabilizer view tells us that a stable world economy requires a dominant country, a hegemon, to supply open markets, countercyclical lending, stable exchange rate, and need to function as lender of last resort through its central bank. This role, of course, has been taken by the United States since the Second World War and before that, United Kingdom. And then there's the weaponizer view, which became very fashionable recently, but that also goes back to Albert Hirschman, 1945. And this view is about asymmetric trade relationships, because trade is not symmetric and balanced as in most of our textbook models, but trade is asymmetric. And Hirschman emphasized that this asymmetric nature of trade is going to give some influence and create supply effects on certain countries. What type of countries? Larger, less dependent countries, using this asymmetry as a coercive power, coercive leverage on the smaller countries. Our work is going to show that global trade and finance networks actually can give you stabilization and weaponization at the same time. This is true for each country, especially when you start focusing on domestic macroeconomic outcomes, and that's going to have very important implications on the monetary policy making of every country and the monetary policy trade-off. So let me make this case. I'm going to, again, use tariffs to make this case. This is the tariffs in 2025, starting in January 2025, coming until March 2026. I mean, you can put this figure in a historical context and you see that tariffs increased a lot in 2025, but that's really not the point. The point is the variability and the heterogeneity, right? So if you look at the figure on the left, US effective tariff rate started somewhere around 2% before the Trump administration inauguration in January 2025, went up to almost 23% around the Liberation Day, and then come back to 10.8% March of this year, 2026. To us, what is more important is the other figure, the colorful figure on the right. This shows you the country sector heterogeneity. I mean, you may not read everything, but you can see the dominance of the colors such as red and purple, and dominance of signs such as circle and pluses and diamonds and so forth. This tells you there has been extreme heterogeneity on tariffs, where tariffs definitely put on China basic manufacturing, but also EU, Mexico, Canada, Japan, United Kingdom on things like advanced manufacturing, foods and beverages, energy, agricultural, and so forth. Now, we would like to understand how should we think about that heterogeneity and how should a central banker think about that heterogeneity. So let's start from the basics. How do we learn about tariffs? How do we think about tariffs? Well, how do we teach this to our students, especially when a large country is involved, large country like United States, an hegemon, and a country that can manipulate terms of trade? So the textbook case is very straightforward, right? So this is from Krugman, Obstfeld, Mellis, and the new work by Ralph Ossa, the former chief economist at the WTO, and Steve Redding put very much the same framework in their 2026 paper. You start at autarky, you are a country that want to consume more, so you open up the trade. Trade is good, you are going to import at the lower world price. Suppliers might lose, but consumers are going to benefit. The country is better off. Then the large country decides to manipulate the terms of trade, puts a tariff. So the large countries now, home price is higher than the world and the foreign price. That part is the tariff revenue. Now you are going to have efficient loss, of course, because you are not buying something from the rest of the world that is inefficient, because you are going to produce that at a higher cost. And then there's this terms of trade gain through the manipulation of the relative price. And the entire optimal tariff idea is about comparing these triangles and the boxes and decides where is the optimal tariff. And if you go back to the AER paper of Ralph Ossa, actually he calculates for a large country, the optimal tariff is going to be somewhere around 12%, 13%, which is, maybe by coincidence, that's what US end up with now as of March 2026. Now, what we would like to start asking again, because we would like to understand this from a central banker perspective, what is missing from this picture? What is missing from this picture that is very informative maybe about thinking an optimal tariff, but it is not going to be informative about understanding the macro impact of tariff? What is missing from that picture is how central banks and financial markets is going to respond to the price increase and cost increase that is going to come through tariff. And thinking that endogenous response of central bankers and the financial markets in a small open economy setting versus global general equilibrium, under complete markets versus incomplete markets, and with a representative agent firm versus heterogeneous firm response is going to create very different answers. And our argument is that although it is difficult, we have to force ourselves to go to global general equilibrium, to go to incomplete financial markets and heterogeneous sectors and price stickiness and firm responses, because that's very critical and at the heart of identifying the aggregate macro impact for my own country and the macro impact globally. Okay, so this is what we do. We write down a new open economy macro framework with global networks, introducing not just trade, but also production and financial networks. And there's going to be 2 new analytical insights coming out of this network. I'm putting equations to the appendix and try to go through the equations through words in the interest of time. So in this N-country J-sector global new Keynesian open economy model, first new analytical insight is this risk-sharing wage that we denote with W hat. What is this wage? This is a deviation from complete financial markets. You can think this as the Buckle-Smith benchmark. At the time you impose the tariff, you being the US, so US imposes tariffs, there is this deviation from the complete financial markets, and the sign of this wage, if it becomes positive or negative, is going to determine at the end if the tariff imposing country is gaining or losing from tariffs, regardless of the retaliation. Even these are unilateral tariffs. And interestingly, another new insight, the sign of this wedge is not only going to depend on the standard things like trade elasticity or shock persistence, how persistent is the tariff, but the network itself. So the linkages between countries, and not just what the US has with other countries, but what everybody has with other countries. So it's a complete new way of thinking this in global general equilibrium. The second new analytical insight is what we call new Keynesian open economy propagation matrix. It is a close cousin to a Leontief inverse in these trade network models, but it is different. It is not an inverse of a matrix, but it's rather a coefficient on the past real marginal cost. And it shows up, it lights up when there are more than one sectors. If J is 1, so you just write a small open economy with one sector, or you write a 2-country global general equilibrium with one sector, you are not going to see that effect. Then you are going to get the standard new Keynesian result that a transitory tariff is going to give you just a one-time price jump. But when J is bigger than 1, when you have more than one sectors, then you are going to have this coefficient that is going to give you not only inflation persistence, with transitory tariff shock, but this is going to rise, this person is going to rise with number of sectors. And the IO linkages, both domestically, what you have in your country, and globally, how you are linked to other countries, both through non-tradable and tradable sectors, is going to increase this persistence of inflation that works through the real marginal cost. On top of that, what we call open economy heterogeneity. What is open economy heterogeneity? The heterogeneous responses of monetary policy by different central banks, how Bank of Japan responds, how Bank of England responds, Fed responds, and combined with the endogenous response of exchange rate, which is again determined in global general equilibrium, is going to amplify this propagation. Now, this is going to be critical. Both these new two objects, two analytical insight, is going to be critical for two things. First and foremost, of course, important for the evolution of global trade flows and the supply chains reshaping. Right? There's this huge push by governments for making the supply chains resilient, nearshoring, reshoring, however you want to think about it. But it is not just going to depend on one industrial policy on one country, but how this global general economy moves. And the second, the domestic macro impact of this is going to be the inflation output trade-off is going to change. Inflation output dynamics is going to change. And it's going to unfortunately lead to stabilization burden being bigger, regardless of the monetary policy rule you use. Stabilization is going to take longer. And the simple intuition here that those real marginal cost deviations is going to travel around the world through that network. And that's why, regardless of your monetary policy, it's just going to take longer than in a world that is not connected through networks. Okay. Why is that the case? What is the intuition behind this? So the key intuition here is the fact that any trade distortion right? You just try to distort the global integration, and tariffs, of course, one way of doing it. They are going to work as a triple shock, right? A demand shock, a supply shock, and a financial shock working through wealth transfers. So demand shock is the standard one, right? You are changing relative demand. Supply shock dimension, we have been talking about this since Governor Uedo's opening speech. Supply shock is going to be more important in this world that is really, really connected through production linkages, especially when you put tariffs on inputs that your firms buy to produce. And then the wealth transfer aspect is going to come from this incomplete financial market dimension. So which means at the end, because of these three hidden shocks hidden under a trade distortion, whether a country gains or loses is a global general outcome. It's determining global general equilibrium. Now, if you think about it, if your what we call risk-sharing wage is negative, right? So the tariff imposing country is gaining. Why is that? Because in that case, wealth effect that's so big that this country is getting. So in this case of U.S., you can, even there is this stagflationary supply shock side, and there's this intertemporal side where you want to postpone consumption in the future because it's now expensive to consume in this moment, those dimensions are going to be overruled by this wealth transfer to your country. But if this risk-sharing wage, this incomplete financial market goes the other way, then even in your country, even you impose unilateral tariffs, you can have inflation, persistent inflation, and larger output decline. An interesting insight here is that on top of the standard channels, right, exchange rate depreciation, creating valuation effect, and being beneficial for countries with large dollar debt or standard terms of trade and all that, there is this extra channel that comes through the networks where you tariff an input, you understand that it is going to hurt your home production, but you may not be understanding and you may not be internalizing that this can actually move the terms of trade against you. Even it looks like you are moving the terms of trade for yourself through the final goods. Because of this tariff on the intermediate input, now the foreign goods can be more valuable compared to your goods, and then terms of trade is going to move against you. And that means the wealth is going to flow abroad, even there is no retaliation. So at the end, network structure is what is going to shape whether tariffs are going to transfer wealth to the United States or to abroad. Let me demonstrate this. So we put 2026 tariffs in our model and calibrate the model. Now we start with the global network as of 2025. So here I'm aggregating this for visual ease to US, Euro area, China, Canada, Mexico, and rest of the world. And rest of the world is, of course, England, Japan, and key emerging markets here. Why I'm using these countries? Because there is a lot of heterogeneity in terms of tariffs and in terms of countries and sectors that is put on these countries during 2025. So it can give me a very clear way of testing the model. Now, what you see in this figure, again, this is the network as of 2025. So whatever attempt we did to make the supply chains more resilient, to make ourselves independent from China because of what happened during 2020, 2021, is already in here. And when you see a dark, thick color arrow here, that means there's a lot of trade between those entities, both final good and intermediate good trade, like you can see China and European area, rest of the world and European area, and so forth. And a thin arrow means there is less trade. This is what happens once you put the tariffs of 2025, actually 2026. Here, we are being very conservative. Tariffs end up being small, so the effects are going to be modest. But still, it's going to take time for the entire general equilibrium globally to work itself out. So this is the beauty of having a model, right? You can do a 12-quarter out exercise. So this is what the world is going to look like in 2029, according to our model. Now, every thicker red arrow here shows you a strengthening trading relationship because there's going to be a lot of trade diversion because of the tariffs United States put. And every thinner red arrow is going to show you a weakening trade relationship. And you can see, even by just looking at it for a second, it is a story of US being isolated in this world, right? So there's a lot of now extra trade between Canada and China, rest of the world and Mexico and Canada, Europe and China and so forth. And US is being connected with thinner and thinner lines. Now, this is, of course, based on our model. You have to buy our model assumptions and all that. As you know, my research over a decade is about using firm-level data to test our macro models and to discipline our macro models. So this is direct firm-level evidence from real data. So this is real firm data, so not some text analysis of news and stuff, which is, of course, the bad thing about using firm-level data, because you have to wait for the firm-level data. Firm-level data is going to come with a lag, which is why we have models. So you have to do both. Now, this is data as of 2025, so it is going to give you the reactions since the pandemic, right? I mean, we have like shock after shock, so whatever firms did to adjust themselves, it is here. The full effect of tariffs is not here, because for that we have to wait for 2026 data. But even for 2025, and I'm showing you here only 5 countries. What are these countries? These are the top suppliers of the United States manufacturing sector. So look at this figure as, the US manufacturing sector. You can think like a large auto manufacturer like Tesla, or another one like in, chips or steel or whatever you want. So the y-axis is going to tell you how much that large US manufacturer buys in terms of inputs from these countries that I show you on the x-axis. What are these different color bars? The blue one is the supply chain data. It's just shipments. It's based on shipments. So if you think this figure like, okay, large auto manufacturer in US, what is the highest blue bar here? Mexico. So, up to 35% of the inputs to a large manufacturer in the US comes from Mexico. Okay. That's great. That's nothing surprising there. You already knew it. I mean, the auto manufacturing is going to be a large part of this story. And of course, Mexico, Canada, and US is a supply chain in terms of autos like optimized to the perfection during the last 2 decades. Now, what is the orange and the green? That's the interesting thing. Orange is what we call investment-based supply chain. So blue is trade-based supply chain, orange is investment supply chain. So we went firm by firm. So every single firm, Tesla, GM, all these guys buy from, we look at their investors. Who is the investor into US supply chain? And that you can see the highest orange bar, China. China is the biggest investor into the US supply chain. So manufacturing companies in US buying from these countries, and the largest investor into those companies that US buys from is China. And then the green is what we call innovation-based supply chain. Now we go and match the patents, intangible capital, technology. What is the operational technology of these firms? It comes back to the highest green bar, to the US. So US buys from different countries, number 1, Mexico. China is the biggest investor into those companies. And then all those companies, still the supply chain operates under the US technology. This might change, of course, but this is the picture as of 2025. Okay. Now, how do we tie this back to the central banker trade-off? We need our model again, right? We need the global general equilibrium model to understand the inflation output trade-off, and dynamics of inflation output trade-off is going to depend on the network. I can do this for any country, but I'm going to show you on purpose the US under a unilateral tariff case, okay? And this is actually a numerical example, so this is here just think about 10% tariff, nothing big or anything, but US does this unilaterally. So I'm plotting US inflation on the left, US output on the right as deviation from the steady state US inflation and steady state output under 3 different monetary policy regimes. So the red one is going to be the look-through regime. The blue one, perfect inflation targeting, perfect CPI stabilization. And the green one is employment stabilization. Now, what is the difference between the dotted line and the solid line? Dotted line is a world when there are no networks, and US is just, treat this as a small open economy, as most of the models does. And the solid line is a world with global networks of production, trade, and finance. The point here is that stabilization burden is much larger under granular networks, right? Every solid line, in terms of, regardless of the policy regime, which is like, the US operating in a world of global networks, deviation from inflation and deviation from output, steady state, takes much longer to go back to that steady state. I mean, you can see inflation takes up to 12 quarters, output takes, up to 11 quarters and so forth, regardless of what the rule is. And the red is very telling here, because if you remember originally, Many US policymakers, most notably Chris Waller, said that this is a one-time transitory tariff shock, it's going to be one-time price jump, we are going to look through, this is a look-through policy, that's the red. That policy is going to give you a persistent inflation that can last over 10 quarters. What about the actual tariff? This is a theoretical exercise I showed you. So let's look at the actual implemented tariffs as of March 2026, and let's kind of separate it what actually implemented at the border and US customs collected revenue. That's the solid blue line. And what has been a threat, meaning, a tariff is announced and then taken back. So again, I'm showing you US inflation, US output, and US consumption under an actual implemented tariff and a tariff threat. You can see in the solid line there is inflation, very modest, 0.4 percentage point increase in inflation, but it is persistent up to, again, 12 quarters. Output goes down, that's of course throughout. That's the long run impact we know from the trade models, and consumption also goes down permanently. That's the implemented tariff. Now, reverse threats, which is you announce when you take the tariff back, that is the dotted dash blue line. It is very interesting that actually inflation goes almost as high as the actual tariff, like to 0.3% inflation, immediately goes back to zero because you take back the tariff. You announce next period, okay, I'm taking this back, I'm not doing it. Now, consumption goes down and then goes back up, very, very small effect. And output just little bit goes up just because of the expectation of these exports if the tariff happens, but of course, it doesn't happen. Now, the point here is like through this inflation expectation channel, actually, even something like a reverse tariff threat can have an inflationary impact. And then the impact on the dollar, depreciation or appreciation, is going to depend if there is also an expectation of retaliation, not an actual retaliation, but expectation of retaliation. If you don't allow that expectation channel to work, and if you say, okay, I'm just going to implement tariffs, imagine Liberation Day tariffs announced and implemented immediately, no retaliation, no nothing, of course, this model is going to give you dollar appreciation, right? It's the standard result, and that's what happened in 2018. 2018, first Trump administration put tariff, dollar appreciated 6%, right? That's the standard effect. Now, what happened during the Liberation Day, actually something very interesting, right? Dollar didn't appreciate, dollar depreciated. And I'm going to show you this in a historical context. So go back to January 2021. So this is the broad dollar index. Going down means dollar appreciation. So dollar was on this appreciation trend, stabilized. And again, a little bit like appreciation here, US election. Still, you have the appreciation trend. And then the inauguration. So after the second Trump's inauguration here, January 2025, dollar started depreciating. This is the Liberation Day. So this is the big depreciation everybody talks about. So it is around like, in the broad dollar, it's not that big, around 2 percentage points in a week. But against euro, it is pretty big. Against euro, it is like almost coming to 9%, okay? And then it's stabilized. Now, we said, okay, this is clearly another shock, right? This just cannot be tariff, because tariff, it has to have an appreciation effect, as happened in real life in the 2018 tariffs. So we put in the model two shocks. This is the dollar exchange rate, a tariff shock, which is going to give you a dollar appreciation going down, and a tariff volatility shock. So this is a second moment shock. This is like the uncertainty about the trade policy, and try to capture this idea of tariff threats. That gives you a dollar depreciation. This is just a one-time, of course, a model effect. We ask ourselves, okay, how much in real life we can explain the dollar depreciation? So going back to last quarter of 2024, this is how much dollar depreciated by the third quarter of 2025. And with only volatility shock, you can explain half of it, okay? Just with the tariff uncertainty. And this is something consistent with the investor expectations. What I'm showing in you the last figure is the expected depreciation of the broad dollar from the Bloomberg client notes. This is not actual depreciation. This is expected depreciation. And if you look at the Liberation Day, there is like this expected appreciation. Why? Because the spot dollar depreciated. And then there is, throughout the rest of the year, there is this consistent expectation of depreciation. Exchange rate is a forward-looking price. So this is completely consistent what is happening in the financial markets, what we are getting out of the bottom. Okay. Let me finish with going back to this stagflationary theme, monetary policy, and international transmission, kind of bringing back what we learned new and what we already know about international transmission of monetary policy. So what do we know and what to expect? If we all now have consensus that this is a new world, it is a geopolitically fragmented world, That means that is a world where all countries are going to use more and more these protectionist tools, try to fragment the global trade, try to fragment the global finance. That world is going to have a persistent upward pressure on prices and persistent downward pressure on growth. So that's a very difficult world for central bankers to navigate. So I am glad that I'm an academic and not a central banker, because that world, central banks are going to have a very hard time in balancing price stability and unemployment. So that's clear. Now, another fact we know, which is also clear, is the large international footprint of US monetary policy. What our work shows that these two things are, what we expect. And a new thing can also happen, a new actor, a new agent in a way, is this cross-country differences in monetary policies, which opens again the door for international coordination of monetary policy. So what do I mean by that? In the face of these frequent global shocks, geopolitical fragmentation, varying from pandemic, wars, oil shocks, all sorts of distortions to globally integrated system, there is going to be a role played by different central bank reactions in this, what we call globalization 2.0, in the new international trade and monetary system. So how is this going to work? Let's first go back to what we know and take the last tightening episode of the Fed, which is, of course, 2022. Fed started tightening in the first quarter of 2022, and I'm going to look at the exchange rate now of other countries. Okay? So exchange rate of advanced economies, so this is Japan, exchange rate of emerging markets, Mexico. So everybody is depreciating vis-a-vis the dollar, which is something always happens when the Fed tightens. Okay, this is not new. Now, instead of separating advanced economy, emerging market, you can also look at the exchange rate responses vis-a-vis the dollar of countries with high monetary policy credibility and low monetary policy credibility. And this is a measure that is going to bring many things. Of course, anchoring the inflation expectations, but also the transparency, accountability, all the things Dawn was talking about today. When you do that type of a separation, instead of an advanced economy, emerging market separation, you see that countries with low monetary policy credibility depreciated much more against the dollar during the last episode of Fed tightening. If we go back to the entire history of Fed tightening, starting in 1980s and bringing till the end of 2022, 2023, what we also know about the government bond spread is, so here again I'm showing the emerging markets. This is from my 2019 Jackson Hole paper, updated. This is from Advanced Economies. What we know is when US tightens, and here I'm using the exogenous US monetary policy shocks, emerging market government bond spreads go up, advanced economy government bond spreads go down. So I expect these forces to be still relevant today, maybe even more so in a geopolitically fragmented world, with the additional force. What is the additional force that is going to be very important for the macro impact of geopolitics is this heterogeneous central bank's response. Here again, I'm going to show you only US inflation and US output. Again, very generic, say 10% tariffs, US puts unilaterally. What happens to US inflation and US output depending on what other countries do. So here you can have China fixing the exchange rate, EU following the real rate rule, which means EU is going to have trade diversion amplified, all countries fixing nominal demand, or everybody is doing Taylor rule, and so forth. But there's a lot of interesting phenomena going on here, where US inflation can be higher, more persistent, deviation from steady state US output can be larger depending on what other countries, especially what other large countries. This is why this is very visible with EU following a different rule, visible on US macro outcomes. To sum up, global trade, production, and finance networks are going to be very important in terms of impact of global and geopolitical shocks on domestic macro outcomes. So if we want to understand our own domestic macro outcomes, we have to think in a global general equilibrium with networks, and that's of course going to give us also the global outcomes. So there are three key points here. The first one is this wealth transfer between countries depending on incomplete financial markets, and that is going to be pinned down by this risk-sharing wedge. And the sign of that wedge is a global general equilibrium outcome shaped by global networks. Second, supply shocks are, cost-plus shocks. They are really important in terms of leading to persistent real marginal cost distortions. And even this is a positive paper, so we don't draw out optimal monetary policy implications, but even you have N country monetary policies doing their jobs, plus there is the endogenous exchange rate adjustment, this is not going to suffice. So go back to Timberberger. So it is not enough to use N country monetary policy plus the exchange rate. Even exchange rate becomes a tool to get rid of these distortions, because you have NJ distortions that is traveling through the network. So this is going to impact everybody in a bad way. Implemented US tariffs, they are small the tariffs, small the macro impact. So in that sense, maybe modest, but still there has been a lot of impact once you start understanding what is happening in global general equilibrium, a lot of trade diversion to Europe. Now, if Liberation Day tariffs were to pass, they didn't, but if were to pass, we can do this counterfactual exercise in our model, the result is actually would have been a global stagflation with exact amounts announced on April to Liberation Day. Okay, let me finish with some food for thought. I started with a question, how should we think about monetary policy making in this new world? And the answer is tough. I try to give you a map of the ways to think about it, and I'm going to now finish with a question. We had 4 stagflationary shocks in 4 years. I mean, you don't have to think the stagflation in terms of 1970s, but basically shocks creating upward pressure on prices and downward pressure on incomes and growth, right? In 4 years, pandemic, 2 wars, tariffs, only one of them is not man-made. All the others are man-made shocks. Why the resilience? So we always talk about the AI boom, the US is doing great and all, but there's this resilience globally, right? Global economy was resilient, not just the US. I mean, there can be additional thing in the US, but in spite of the 4 stagflationary global shocks, world end up being resilient. This takes us back to Kindleberger-Hirschman. This is very clear in our work that global interdependence, global integration of finance and trade and production is going to give you macro stabilization and weaponization at the same time. So I draw on several papers that are all available on the webpage of Global Linkages Lab. Thank you.
Thank you, Şebnem. Very rich and thought-provoking. Now let's turn to our discussant, Professor Ippei Fujiwara.
Okay, thank you very much. What a model! Pretty much everything in the model, and N country model with the S sector under the incomplete market. So as a result, I needed to read a lot. But I would like to congratulate Şebnem on the course for great achievement to put everything together and make it a reasonable model. So that although Şebnem did a great job, let me start with the summary of the paper. So this is a very nice and ambitious paper with relevance to the current policy debates, especially tariffs, and a rich global new Keynesian open economy model with multiple countries, sectors, input-output linkages, and nominal rigidities, and incomplete markets. And in the paper, tariffs are not only relative price distortions, but also demand shocks, supply shocks, and international wealth transfer shocks. And the paper comes with clear analytical intuition. Today, Şebnem didn't have a time to explain the analytical details, but the paper is full of analytical investigations. And so therefore, it offers very nice analytical intuitions. And the paper offers very important messages. The tariffs can be stagflationary, but the size and the magnitude depend on the risk-sharing wedges. And the global production networks generate persistence and the marginal cost distortions. Monetary policy cannot generally offset all sectoral distortions when the policy instruments are national, but the distortions are country sector specific. And this model incorporates many first-order mechanisms missing from the plain vanilla open economy new Keynesian model. So that pretty much everything in this model. The first ingredient is the global input-output networks, and their networks generate persistence. And the nested CS shapes the sign and the magnitude of tariff spillovers, and the sectoral heterogeneous nominal rigidities make the cost distortions persistent. And that particularly I like this incomplete market with non-zero net international investment positions. This shift wealth across countries through the risk-sharing wedges. So the tariff can affect this wealth transfer. This is really a new channel, and I really like this feature. And the heterogeneous monetary policy leads to asymmetric exchange rate, inflation, and output responses. Also, paper investigate the various type of the international price setting, PCP or local currency pricing or dominant currency pricing. They matters for the exchange rate pass-through. So again, I would like to say pretty much everything in the model. And also, what I like about this paper is that the paper does not simply simulate the rich model and the report impulse responses. So that sometimes in open economy model, it's not so easy to get the analytical intuition. So just showing the impulse responses and offering the intuitions. But this paper is different. The analytical linearized equilibrium identifies how primitives map into propagation. So you can check the responses with the theory. That's a really great advantage of this paper. And as Shebnem mentioned, New Keynesian open economy propagation matrix, which is kind of the dynamic analogous of the Leonchev inverse, governs the real marginal cost distortions and offers a clean analytical handle on inflation persistence and the cross-country spillover. So you can understand the cross-country spillovers if you look carefully into this matrix. Right, and let me talk about the feature which I found especially impressive. That is the data discipline in the incomplete market, the steady state. The paper explicitly moves away from the usual zero net foreign asset benchmark. And this is not a technical detail. It is difficult to make the steady state of balanced payment condition look realistic. So that, for example, negative net international investment position in the United States requires a positive trade or current account balance, and which is far from the data. So this paper builds an incomplete markets environment that is closer to the observed external position through the risk-sharing wedge and the capital accounting wedge. So two wedges makes the balance of payment steady state realistic. And this is a key part. Non-zero net international investment position at the valuation channel. So there, tariffs affect wealth through existing external positions in addition to the terms of trade movement. So great paper. So I can finish my presentation here, but I'm a discussant, so I need to make some comments. So let me do my job, okay? Then the first comment is related to the part which I like the most, so the risk-sharing wedges. The risk-sharing wedge is central to this mechanism. So that this is the equation. So if W equals 0, we end up with the standard complete market condition, real exchange rate pinned down by the relative consumption, relative marginal utility of consumption. Under the incomplete market in their paper, tariff shocks moves W. So this is the interesting part. The interpretation depends on how the incomplete market block is closed. So that authors introduced a positive portfolio adjustment cost, which provides an explicit stationary devices, as discussed in closing small open economy or closing open economy literature. In the paper, it is written, the implied debt level parameterizes the portfolio adjustment cost that anchor deviation from the steady state. But the analytical wedge result seems to use the zero cost logic. So that in the paper, it's written, we set the psi, so the portfolio adjustment cost equals 0. And as a result, we get the martingale properties in wedges, which is really popular. You can encounter this kind of the situation with the typical incomplete market model. And it seems like the balance of payment block and the non-explosive net foreign asset condition seems to work as an equilibrium selection device for these wedges. And because Shebnem is the global expert of the incomplete market and the complete market, so I think it must be. I think it's implied in the paper, but it would be useful to clarify whether this is the portfolio cost to zero limit of the model with a positive portfolio cost or not. If this is written more explicitly, I think many people can understand this structure very well. And one constructive way forward is to discipline the wedge empirically. So this is the definition of the wedge. We have a Q data, CH as a data, CF as a data. So by changing the sigma intertemporal elasticity of substitution, we can compute the wedges. So estimate the local projections with tariff shocks. Then I check whether the responses are in line with the model theoretical prediction or not. And this would provide an empirical counterpart to the model implied risk-sharing wedge. So I talk too much about the incomplete market because this is the feature which I like the most. And the final comment related to the incomplete market, there are several papers which are endogenizing the Backus-Smith wedges. For example, Corsetti, De Rora, Leducci, and Benigno Tennyson. They generate the Backus-Smith wedges from the explicit frictions and the technologies. I know the current model uses a particular incomplete market structure and the risk-sharing weights, too much international wealth transfer, and a steady-state net international investment position. This is a great achievement, but I wonder whether tariff responses changes if the wedges were generated by these more explicit mechanisms or not. Okay, then exchange rate, because whenever you work in open economy model, you are interested in whether we can replicate the realistic nominal exchange rate behavior. This paper studies the monetary policy and the exchange rate propagation, so the exchange rate channel should be empirically credible. The wedge affects exchange rate dynamics, but its empirical implications for UIP deviations are less clear. So my question is, does the model generate realistic exchange rate dynamics after a monetary policy shock? And comment 5 is, I think, a bit beyond the scope of this paper. This paper is the first paper to show the realistic theoretical responses to the tariff shocks, but maybe beneficial to do some exercises compared to the existing empirical studies. So this paper compares some responses with the observed movements around the recent tariff episode, but the observed episode also contains many other shocks. So it would be useful to compare the model with empirical tariff shock impulse response functions from the local projections or narrative identification. Nowadays, we have very many papers doing this kind of things. Final one is really technical. So the method of undeterminate quotient is used for deriving analytical expressions. But method of undeterminate quotient by itself doesn't establish uniqueness or determinacy. And if I read a paper, so they say that you can obtain the Blanchard-Kahn stable condition not in a full system. So I would like to know that whether Blanchard-Kahn stable equilibrium is obtained in a full system, especially if the incomplete market is closed with the non-zero positive portfolio adjustment cost. I want to know what happened to the Blanchard-Kahn stable equilibrium. I mean the number of the explosive roots and the number of the jump variables. Okay, so this is the final remarks. The paper brings together many realistic mechanisms. The contribution is not only quantitative simulations. The paper also provides analytical objectives, decompositions, and economic intuition for how tariff shocks propagate. So I expect this framework to become a benchmark for studying the effect of tariffs at the business cycle frequencies with monetary policy, international finance, and the global trade linkages. So kudos to Şebnem and her co-author. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Kudos to you, Ippei. Now, Şebnem, your turn for the comments and questions.
Yes, sure. Oh, thank you very much. These are great comments. I mean, we did most of these things. Let me say, but we can highlight more, because every simplifying assumption to get the analytical solution, we do a full numerical check on including the stability conditions and all that, and the portfolio adjustment cost, like with the grid and everything. But let me say something on your comment for exchange rate, realistic or not. That's important. We test the model first. We kind of do a road test on the 2018 tariffs. 2018 tariffs model does great. We match the appreciation, and there's a lot of work now by Fed, both Boston Fed, New York Fed, like where they estimate using microdata and great identification the impact of 2018 tariffs. So we match that. Okay, then this comes, and then of course model is going to give you appreciation, right? So the model is going to fail on the 2025 tariffs, exactly as you said. So we have to put another wedge. That's the UIP wedge. So that's, the UIP wedge is needed to match the depreciation that happened, right? So then, so you just throw it there and then you can match it, then it's real. But then where is this coming from? So that's this tariff volatility idea to kind of microform the UIP wedge, and that's this other paper we did for the AEA papers and proceedings.
So many papers.
No, not just two. Okay, so that's important, right? I mean, without the UIP wage, you are not going to, because it's going to give you appreciation. So the local projection is a great idea. We can definitely do that. We didn't do that, and then yes, we can. I mean, there is a whole appendix on that footnote 17, right? I mean, that's the trick we do, right? I mean, the method of undetermined coefficient and, like, you know, taking the portfolio adjustment cost to zero in the limit gives you the power to separate the new Keynesian block and the balance of payments block and solve them separately. So that's how we can solve it. Yeah. Great comments. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thanks to both of you. Now we have about 10 minutes for questions, comments. Okay, Phil first, and then followed by Pierre-Olivier. Phil.
So let me congratulate Şebnem on this is a really great project. And I think this is an area where there's the kind of pass-through from the full-scale academic work here to policy work is kind of pretty rapid. So at the ECB, you know, we do implement now a kind of big network model of the world economy, and as Şebnem highlighted, you do get this much bigger. When you have a supply shock, it travels through the network, it amplifies the supply shock, and indeed increases duration. And that really is a very illuminating mechanism. It can be different for demand shocks. So with demand shocks, the network tends to compress the response. So but let me point out one issue which you had. Basically, this global network is both an opportunity and a risk, depending. And in 2022, Europe was able to replace Russian gas and other inputs by looking around the world, finding alternatives. So the substitution across inputs was important. Whereas on this occasion now, this is much more, not strictly global, but more or less a global shock. There's nowhere to go. You know, the price of energy-intensive goods are going up everywhere. Whereas Russian gas is much more local cost shock in Europe rather than global. So the hope that you can substitute out of this shock, I mean, there's still a lot of impressive substitution going on, but you can't substitute out of this shock as we could in 22.
Okay, so yes, Philip, you're exactly right. The way we try to do that in the model, I mean, okay, this is three-layer CES, right? So the fact that Germany built LNG terminals in 15 months when everybody is saying this is going to take years, that's, you know, something very, very extensive margin, and it's very hard to put in these models with CS. But there's still things you can do as long as you are using empirically relevant, you know, estimate elasticity. So we try to do, like, you know, kind of substitution at the bottom layer, like, you know, the final good layer, and then complementarity at the very top input layer, like, you know, steel and energy complements, or steel and lumber and all that. And then you can also do things like, but to your point, if the shock is global, hit everybody, then can I, you know, is the Brazil steel substitute to Chinese steel, which is US is important crazy to build these data centers, right? So all those things, you know, you can try to use different values ranging from complementary to substitution, different countries, different inputs, final goods differing. But again, you are always going to be limited with the CS structure, which is going to be weak on the extensive margin, like completely building, you know, new production facilities, and also the empirically estimated elasticities. I think there has to be a lot more work done using very granular microdata to do these things. And I have to, you know, definitely compare to the ECB model, but I'd like to think this all goes back to the 2022 Sintra paper I did for you guys. So I hope on the pandemic, inflation, and separating to demand and supply.
Thanks. Let's go for Pierre-Olivier, followed by Shiyuchi-san. Pierre-Olivier.
Yes. Also a big fan of the research agenda here, and Şebnem, as you know, at the fund we're also developing input-output dynamic models for the global economy, and we think that that's very important. But I guess the question I have is, after I've seen you present and the discussion, there are two dimensions that could be emphasized, and it's not clear to me at the end for the exercise you're asking which of the two is the most important one. So one dimension is on the trade side and input-output, the global network part. You could do this in a standard sort of trade fashion, or imposing that there is zero net foreign asset positions, and as Ippei was emphasizing, this is not what you do. But that would highlight the role of the trade network, if you want. Or you could go and focus on the financial network and the whole cross-border participations, and have a very complex valuation effects depending on who is holding what and how that's responding to a change in tariffs and exchange rates and all of that. And you're going in that direction, but you're not going all the way. You're just doing an NIP that's not zero, but you're just sort of trading US bonds, basically. So you don't have the granularity on the financial side. But your results seem to suggest that that NIP being different from zero is actually quite important. So at the end of the day, the question for me is, which of the two is likely to be most important? If I listen to Ichikoki and Mukin, I mean, the present value of the external budget constraint has to hold, regardless of whether you're in a model with a global network or not with a global network. And then we can look at each of the components and think about whether there's a valuation change, whether there's a net present value of trade surpluses, whether it's convenience yield, or however you want to call it. And in a sense, have you thought about testing your model by going back to these different components and seeing whether you get the orders of magnitude right?
Yeah, no, this is a very good point, and I fully agree with you. Right now, we are emphasizing both. And we can go all the way, of course, to the financial side. But that, partly why we didn't. There are two reasons why we didn't do that. First is our financial structure is there is a U.S. bond and there's a local currency bond, and that's that. We don't have equities. We don't have any of that richness, right? So in that sense, it becomes a question how realistic we are going to be capturing this richness. And second, which is where I think this is not an issue. We nest OLEX and DIMA's mechanism, right? We add on to them, and that's why we still want to keep that network in terms of trade side, because this risk-sharing wage has two components. One is the terms of trade component, and the other is this valuation through the financial channel component. And they can go different ways, right? So in a sense, right, if you only look at OLEG and DIMA, you are missing this other part, which is important, especially when you start putting these sectoral tariffs, right? And then, so in that sense, we want to keep that. But you're exactly right. I mean, always room for improvement. But I think, to push the other one fully and then say, can I get the whole inside by completely killing network? Then you need to richen the financial structure with equities and all that.
Okay. Finally, Shioji-san.
Thank you. It's Shioji, Chuo University. Thank you for the great presentation. And it's a very nice model, but also it's a gigantic model. I'm still trying to digest what's going on with the help of Ippei's discussion. So two questions sort of related with each other. First, I understand that in the new open economy macro literature, that in which currencies the traded goods are priced can often play a significant role, as Ippei's discussion mentioned. So what's the underlying assumption that you're using? And I want to know if the results are in any way sensitive to the underlying assumption about the goods pricing. The second question is also, we have learned in the past 15 years or so that in which currencies the international liabilities are priced can often play a significant role in determining the transmission mechanism of monetary policy, for example. So what's the assumption that you are employing, and are the results again sensitive to the choice of which currencies do you assume that those liabilities are being priced? Thank you.
Yes, so this is all very clearly explained in the paper. We have written the paper in a very pedagogical way. So it is not a giant big black box, actually. It's exactly quite the contrary. The whole point is to provide very clean analytical equations and intuition to what is really a giant black box in general, when it is used by big policy institutions. So in that sense, if you go, I think, it will be very clear. But just to answer your questions, we do all, right? I mean, as Ippei is saying, so you start with producer currency pricing, but of course you have to match the fact that there's dollar currency pricing, as shown in Pierre Olivier's work and Gita's. So we use their data to discipline that. So it's a hybrid. So it is, it's a New Keynesian model. It is the Rothenberg pricing, and we introduce this hybrid discipline by the numbers we get from Gita and Pierre Olivier on the share of the dollar pricing and the producer currency pricing. And on top of that, because there is this very active firm-level literature that traces the entire pricing and shows the importance of retailer sector pricing to market. We also have that heterogeneity because we have sectors, right? We have a whole retail sector there. So all of that is in there, and then it is disciplined what the empirical literature is telling us. And in terms of the currency of liabilities and assets, this goes back to Pierre Olivier's question. We have it, it is simple. I mean, it's already a lot of steps to get out of the balance trade, zero current account, network. So we have this net position, right? Net international investment position. So it is asset minus liabilities. So that is in dollars in a sense, right? We don't separate this. Again, goes back to Pierre Olivier's question. And there's of course a local currency domestic bond, right? So, but then we have, realistic valuation effect. If you look at the net position of the US, 90% of the GDP with 1.6% dollar depreciation. So whatever happened, actually, we can match with the model. We are not, giving you anything counterfactual. In that sense, inflation number coming out is also well disciplined.
Okay, so you got everything, all in the model.
Well, not everything, but try to
almost
not create any counterfactual thing.
Thank you.
Almost
Thank
everything. That's
I will read your papers.
Okay, time is up, and thank you once again, 7up. Thank you, Ippei, and thank you, audience, for the wonderful discussions. This concludes the sessions.